Dobrý večer.
So, good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome at tonight's debate called Prosperity or Decline, Post-Communist Transformation. My name is Kateřina Smejkalová from Friedrich Ebert Stiftung in the Czech Republic, one of the organizations holding the debate. We have a very busy schedule for guests, for speakers, so just a very brief introduction. And I think that face-to-face to the topical situation in Central Europe and Eastern Europe, we cannot just explain the situation by speaking about what happened before 1989, but also we have to maybe criticize the following period. And the debate sometimes is quite pointed and does not allow any nuances or shades of gray. So the debate in the Czech Republic started after 89, around or recently also, around the series called the 90s, or the book Taking Stock of Shock, social changes of social causes of the 1980 revolutions. Then there was the crisis in Ukraine, the invasion, which has attracted all the attention. We shouldn't really walk on this wooden floor. Here's some problem with the mics. So today's discussion is an attempt to follow up the debate, because the war started by Russia has a geopolitical dimension. A lot of attention is focused on it. It's also related to the domestic development in the region after the fall of the Soviet Union. We are going to discuss it with the authors of Taking Stock of Shock, ethnographer and professor of political studies, Kristen Ghodsee. She's online, you cannot see her. And political scientist and professor Mitchell Orenstein, he's sitting next to me. The Czech perspective historian from the Institute for Contemporary History, Veronika Pehe, and political scientist from Charles University, Ondřej Slačálek. So before I ask the two speakers to take the floor, I'd like to greet the editor-in-chief of the Práva Salon. He's co-holding the debate with us, and we'll need a mic for him because of the stream, and the interpreters cannot hear him. So very briefly, I'd like to thank Friedrich Ebert Stiftung and Kateřina Smejkalová for inviting the Právo newspaper Salon review. We also published her review of the book. I look forward to all your contributions, your comments. The Forbes magazine sometimes has interviews with the Czech billionaires, and no one asks them about the first billion and how they got it. So now, without further delay, let's start, and it will be Mitchell Orenstein who will take the floor. Come.
Hi, everybody. I'm going to speak in English. Mluvím malo po česku. Mluvím česky, or mluvil jsem česky před
My Czech is not very good. I learned Czech 20 years ago, but I cannot speak Czech very well.
The book that Kristen, Ghodsee, and I have written together, Taking Stock of Shock, and what this book tries to do is something I think relatively unique, trying to take stock of the socioeconomic results of transition after about 30 years. This isn't, the clicker is not clicking.
It apparently takes some time. Yeah,
Do you think it's actually
it takes some
working?
time.
Oh, I see, okay. Okay, there it is. So this is the cover of our book that was recently published by Oxford University Press in the last year. Okay, this is a bit of a issue, but it's taking a long time for the clicker to pay attention. Where's the computer? Ah, there it is. Okay, so I'm going to tell you a little bit about the reason we wrote the book. Actually, the book originated from a debate between myself and my co-author, Kristen Ghodsee, who you'll see in a moment. She was on the screen briefly. She's joining us by Zoom. About a blog post, actually, by Branko Milanovic. Branko Milanovic is a well-known student of inequality and of transition. He worked for many years at the World Bank, and in 2014, he published a kind of surprising blog post, a sort of provocative blog post about the results of transition, in which he argued that most countries had experienced a failed transition, and only a small percentage of people actually lived in transition countries where the transition succeeded. And we realized in debating this that we had, even though both of us, my colleague Professor Ghodsee and myself, had spent 25 years working on the political economy of transition, we had entirely different perspectives about the success and failure of transition, in part because my work had focused on Poland and the Czech Republic, and her work had focused on Bulgaria, right? And you can imagine Bulgaria was a less successful case of transition, but also because of methodological differences, right? My work came from political science and economics, hers from the point of view of ethnography. And so we learned that different disciplines had different viewpoints about transition that we were debating. And so this book became kind of a dialogue between the two of us about, you know, if we can come up with a similar view of transition. In fact, when you look for market transition online, if you search images for market transition in Central Europe, you'll either see images like this one, which are images of a very happy sort of Christmas market, I think, in Czech Republic, maybe in Prague. Or you'll see other images that look more like the following one, which like this one, which are, you know, these sort of devastating images of poverty, right, essentially in you know, Central or Eastern Europe. And that corresponds really well with different perspectives in the social sciences, where essentially some social scientists believe in more or less what is often called, we call the sort of J-curve transition, right? The idea that there's a transition recession, a dip, but it's followed by a very big growth in the economy, and eventually the countries have succeeded very well in the transition. In fact, there's no real reason to talk about transition anymore. Many people who we debated with in the course of writing and presenting the book have argued, why are you even talking about transition, right? Transition, you know, happened a long time ago. It doesn't happen anymore. There's no particular point in bringing up this subject. And then the other perspective, however, which you'll also be familiar with, I think, is the kind of disaster capitalism narrative, right? This is more similar to the narrative of Vladimir Putin. I think you'll all be familiar that Vladimir Putin bases the justification for his regime on the idea that the 1990s, the period of market reform, was such a disaster, such a total collapse, such a total failure, that it's necessary now for Russia to have a very strong, ruler who will keep the West at bay and advance a more nationalistic view of the economy. So these two perspectives are hard to reconcile. First of all, they seem quite opposite to one another. Secondly, they're highly politicized. So the J-curve narrative tends to be the dominant narrative within, I think it's fair to say, academic departments in Central Europe, but also within international institutions, in journalism, perhaps. J-curve narrative is pretty much the dominant thing, and if you say otherwise, it's like not so good. But the disaster capitalism narrative is also very politicized, right, and comes from a certain place. A lot of the more authoritarian leaders tend to support this. They're also embedded in different disciplines. This is the thing we learned, that in the political science and economics, we tend to believe in this J-curve narrative. In anthropology, they're completely on the side of sort of the disaster capitalism narrative. Anthropology very often focuses on the poor people, the disadvantaged, and so what they're showing through ethnographic research is often the complete disasters, that have occurred. So our project in this book, and I think it's a really interesting, really important project, is to ask a question. The way we approach this is to ask a question: which of these narratives is right? I mean, our thinking was, these narratives, one of them has to be right and one of them has to be wrong, right? Because they're so incompatible, right? And so the way to tell this across this disciplinary divide is gather evidence from many disciplines, from economics, from political science, from public opinion, from demography, from ethnography, and compile a sort of complex picture, and that will show one way or the other one of these is right. To make it very clear, and I have to keep track of time, you maybe should remind me, but to make it very clear at the outset, what we find in the book is there's actually very, very strong evidence for both of these perspectives, okay? So both the J-curve perspective and the disaster capitalism perspective. In certain countries, in certain regions or cities, in certain demographic groups, in certain individuals, you observe a J-curve transition, right? People dropping and doing amazingly well, right? So the first thing I want to say is that, that's absolutely true. And there's a lot of evidence of that on life satisfaction surveys, on economics. At the same time, there is tremendous evidence that also shows that in different countries, in different regions of the same country, in different people, even in the same city, you can also find evidence of, very strong evidence of this disaster approach, that some people didn't really survive the transition actually, or suffered for a very long period of time. And I'll show you some data on this. So our narrative is essentially, our findings are essentially that what we call an inequalities approach, that this is a unique event, actually a pretty unusual event, where a lot of people did really well off and a lot of people did badly, just depending on sort of where they were positioned in this thing. So I'm having trouble flipping through the slides, but I think I already told you this, that we're gathering evidence. We gather a lot of evidence in the book that alone makes it an interesting book to read, because you see a lot of different evidence from different fields. And also, by the way, all the evidence is online, so if you don't like it or you're interested in it, you can go and find it all and download it and make your own stories about it. And I already sort of, so the bottom line here is that transition, our picture of transition is millions of people becoming more prosperous, while millions more are suffering the worst recession in modern history. Let me just repeat that. The post-communist transition recession was the worst recession in modern history. Okay, while being told at the same time that everything is going fine, everything is going great. And so I think that finding sort of helps to understand some of the politics around transition, right? Why it's certain views are unaccepted in certain company, and politics has become in a way so polarized as well as a result of this. So just one chart, and I don't know how I'm doing on time. Do I have 5 or 10 minutes?
Yeah,
okay.
Yeah, of course.
So this is the one chart that kind of illustrates our argument the best. And this is just standard economic data you can get from the World Bank or IMF.
And what we chart is, but we chart it a little bit differently. We choose the top 10 countries, the most successful countries, that's the green line. We chart the least successful post-communist countries, that's the red line, and we chart the medium countries, that's the yellow line. And then we compare the results in this chart of economic results to the Great Depression of the 1930s in the United States. That's the blue line. So if you look at the blue line, the Great Depression it most nearly approximates the situation of the best performing countries in the post-communist world, which would include the Czech Republic and Poland and basically the Visegrad countries and Slovenia, et cetera. Actually, the Great Depression is a little worse in terms of the decline that happens. And so overall, the Great Depression is slightly worse than the situation of the best performing countries. But unbeknownst to many social scientists, but according to the data from the IMF and the World Bank, the 10 worst performing post-communist countries suffered a total level of decline that was double that of the Great Depression. So they lost not 30% of their economy, but 60% of their economy. And never returned, actually, on average, never returned to the level they were at in 1989. Okay, that's an average, so we find there are approximately 7 or so countries that still haven't probably returned to where they were in 1989. And that will include some countries that you might expect, like Tajikistan, but also some you might not expect. I'm not sure that Georgia's in there, but I think Georgia or some other countries that have been counted as success stories would be in this category. Whoops, I don't know how that happened. Okay, I want to go back now. Okay, now it's working. All right, so the median countries, the average post-communist country lost 40% of their economy and didn't come back to 1989 levels of production until 17 years after. And if you just look at the area under the status quo line of these yellow countries, and you compare it to the amount of consumption loss during the Great Depression, it's approximately 3 to 5 times greater. So in post-communist countries overall, you can say that the consumption loss, the total loss, was about 3 to 5 times greater than the Great Depression. In fact, according to Madison Project, which studies historic macroeconomic data, it is by far the worst recession ever in any country, any set of countries in modern history, okay? And that's kind of a key thing, I think, a key factor. But it's happening at the same time that a lot of people are doing really, really well, right? And I think also just another point on this, if you started in year 1 and said to somebody, you're gonna have a 20% loss of income, and then in year 20, you're gonna have 80% more income, bless you. Many people would say, that's a good deal, right? But how many people would choose the red line, right? Not very many people would choose that, I think. Okay, now it's decided not to work again. Okay, so one of the interesting factors, and I don't want to go too long because my colleague Kristen wants to speak, and I think I'm really running out of time, yeah?
Yeah, you have some.
Okay.
3 to 5 minutes still.
So one of the reasons, many people I suspect in this audience weren't aware that the post-communist recessions were the worst ever in modern history, right? And part of the reason is because there's in effect been a cover-up. I hate to be a conspiracy theorist, in these day and age, but in fact, economists have covered this up. We read the economic literature and review it very carefully, and the reality is that most liberal economists will say, this didn't really happen, that this economic data is just wrong. It's purely wrong, primarily for 2 reasons. One, because we don't really know what the level of economic production was under communism. So 1989, we're not sure. And secondly, because we're not measuring the gray economy, and therefore we just can't say much about, in fact, how big and in fact, many economists simply say there was no recession. There was no post-communist recession. It was a fiction, essentially. So looking at that seriously, we thought that argument in a way justifies our research approach really well, because it sort of suggests that one shouldn't take seriously any one discipline's data, right? The economists don't take their own data seriously. So therefore, what we try to do in the book, just to give you a sense of our method, is we try to triangulate and compare the data from economics with the data from demography and the data from public opinion polling and many other areas. And we produce charts that are similar to this one, where, for instance, we're comparing the homicide rate with the poverty rate. And what the homicide rate shows is that the homicide rate does, in fact, correspond very, very clearly with the poverty rate as measured by the World Bank, right? And so it gives, in a way, a secondary set of evidence which suggests that, in fact, there was a massive demographic crisis. In fact, there are a bunch of other social indicators that would suggest that there was a really bad economic event that occurred at this time. So I just want to say 2 words about this chart, which is that a lot of people will tell you, another sort of trope in the economics literature is there was no alternative, right? There was absolutely no alternative, no other way of doing things. Actually, there was an alternative, and it was tried in China and Vietnam. And at the same years that East Europe is suffering from the worst economic recession in world history, China and Vietnam are growing dramatically, right? At the beginning of the period, China is a smaller economy than Russia, and now it's many times larger. And this, kind of shows you the comparison a little bit of these results, which again is something that is sort of an unmentionable in certain circles, but there it is in the data. Okay, so I'm not going to show you the other charts. We do a lot of maps that kind of show cool stuff, but I think at this point I'm going to just turn it over to, we look at, a bunch of different data and sort of good, bad, other, but okay, this isn't cooperating. But anyway, I want to turn it over to my colleague Kristen Ghodsee, who's going to talk. I've talked mostly about the economic and demographic data, and she's going to speak a little bit more about some of the public opinion data and the ethnographic data that we gather for this project, and tell you some vignettes about that. Thank you.
Díky moc.
Thanks a lot. Well, I'd like to introduce Kristen Ghodsee. Could you please connect, or she is actually connected, but we would love to see her and see her presentation. Tak, a je to na tobě, Kristen. Vidíme už ty slajdy, či slide, ano. Tak.
You're there.
Yeah?
Yeah.
Okay.
So go. You're up.
Yeah, I'm trying to share my screen.
It was shared a second ago.
Okay.
There it
Can you
is.
see it now?
Yeah.
Okay, great. So first, I'd like to apologize for my voice. I have a flu, so I'm running on like very little in the way of vocal cords. And given that we have little time, and I would love to make sure that we have plenty of time for debate, I'm just going to highlight a few little details about some of the ethnographic and public opinion data that we found, but with a particular focus on Germany, which is where I am right now. So when the reunification of Germany was proposed, then Chancellor Helmut Kohl told the Germans, the East Germans in particular, but by telling this to the East Germans, he was also in some ways telling this to most East Europeans who are also going to be transitioning from state socialism into free markets and democracy. No one will be worse off than before, but it will be much better for many. This was Helmut Kohl's implicit promise for the revolutions that happened in 1989. But very soon after this promise was made, it became apparent in East Germany. And it's really important for me to talk a little bit about the East German situation because, unfortunately, Mitchell and I, Professor Orenstein and I, were unable to include data from East Germany in our book because with the reunification, East Germany ceased to exist as a sovereign country. And so it became a part of Greater Germany. But it was very clear that there was a huge social and economic toll which was being extracted from the people of Eastern Germany in the immediate post-reunification era. Now, this is a quote from the director of the privatization agency called the Treuhand, a guy called Manfred Bock. And he admits that the present privatization process is also characterized by grave labor difficulties. Although the enterprises of the Treuhand presently employ 2.1 million people, after 4 million 1 year before, some 400,000 will have to be dismissed by the end of 1991. Their official dismissal will mean that unemployment in East Germany could go up to 40% by the end of the year. And he went on to say that in the fall of 1991, after 1 full year of this privatization process, West German industry has mainly used privatization to broaden its production base and gain access to a market of 16 million consumers. So Manfred Bock, who at the time was the director of the privatization agency, understood very clearly that privatization in Eastern Germany was not for the benefit of the people. In fact, the people were gravely suffering from this privatization process. And instead, it was primarily to the benefit of West German corporations who either bought and shut down their East German competitors, or they bought and incorporated these manufacturing facilities into their own production where they could pay lower wages. And they could expand the markets for their goods to a new population of 16 million consumers who had previously been shut out of West German markets. So very clearly, and from very early on, the reunification of Germany, the privatization of German industry resulted into a massive deindustrialization of East German factories and massive unemployment. And I think even within the German context, and as I say, I'm presenting this material to you today from Freiburg in southern Germany, there is an unwillingness to recognize the social and economic and personal costs of this transition. So for instance, German researchers in 1998 confirmed increased mortality rates for East Germans between 1989 and 1990. And they attributed these excess deaths to the drastic social, political, and economic changes that took place during the transition from the socialist to the market economy. The German authors found the rise in deaths from alcoholism, heart and circulatory problems, and suicide causally related to the reunification process, mostly among middle-aged men. Thousands lost their lives prematurely from the psychosocial stress associated with the transition. Now, these were German researchers speaking about the situation in Germany. Sorry about that. So even decades after the reunification of Germany, and here's the thing, is that if you're only looking at the economic data, if you're only looking at Germany as a whole, Eastern Germany is obviously a success story because people have a much higher standard of living than they had prior to 1989. But when you compare the former West to the former East, what you can see very clearly is that even as late as 2013, there were much higher unemployment rates in the East compared to the West. You also had much lower levels of disposable income in the East compared to the West. you also had a massive demographic decline. The percentage of young people among the total population was catastrophic for eastern part of Germany. So many young people migrated to the West, leaving behind parents, leaving behind families, leaving behind opportunities, and gutting rural areas of young people. You can still see this today if you travel in Saxony or in Thuringia or in these areas, Mecklenburg-Vorpommern in the north. There's this massive gutting of the population in these eastern parts of Germany. We also see very clearly with life satisfaction that there is a big difference, a persistent difference between these two parts of Germany because of the way that the transition process was carried out. And so it's not as if people didn't know that this was happening. So this is a research paper from 2008 from the Leibniz Information Center for Economics. And this quote, I think, tells you everything that you need to know. In 2008, a visiting economist from Mars, confronted with only these GDP data, might well conclude that an economic disaster on the scale of the Great Depression had befallen some 400 million of the world's population, which, by the way, is very consistent with what Professor Orenstein and I found in 2021, right? So this paper was published in 2008, but we're only having this conversation about this realization decades later, which I think is really a bit of a problem. And even 30 years after the fall of the Berlin Wall, the anniversary was celebrated in 2019, there were continued reports that East Germans feel inferior. And we clearly see this even in the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development, the EBRD, even in their own data. And this is one of the international financial institutions that was primarily responsible for putting in some of these policies that were, that caused some of this disaster capitalist situation. Even in their own reports, they find that those who were born at the start of the transition, so that means within a year or two of the start date of the transition, which would be 1989 in Eastern Europe and 1991 in the former Soviet Union, on average, they're about 1 centimeter shorter than those born before or after that cohort. And this reflects factors like stress and malnourishment, which is what you would see for children who are growing up in a war zone. So from even the EBRD's own internal perspective, the stress of that initial transition shock was equivalent to that of a war. And what we're seeing in Eastern Europe, and again, in Eastern Germany in particular, from an ethnographic point of view, is the way in which populist parties of the right are using this disaster capitalism narrative, and more importantly, the gaslighting of the population into believing that things were going really well when, in fact, they weren't going very well. It's having political ramifications. And so this is a municipal election in Leipzig from the Alternative for Deutschland party. They're saying that we should have a change, Die Wende, we should have a change for Leipzig. You can see here again, these are the 2019 elections in Brandenburg, where the AfD party, the Alternative for Deutschland party, is saying complete the change, write history, take back your land. The East stands up. And even the far left party, Die Linke, also put up signs that said, for the East, respect, dignity, and recognition. And I think that this call for recognition is really important. There were a lot of people in Eastern Europe who suffered, and their suffering has been completely ignored. And part of what we're trying to do is to point out that, Helmut Kohl's promise in 1989 that no one would be worse off, but for many it would be better, actually turned out to be the reverse, that many would be worse off than before, but it will be much better for a few. Thank you.
Díky moc, Kristen.
Thank you very much, Kristen. We are getting to the Czech comments. First of all, I'll ask Veronika Pehe, who is a historian. Thank you for giving me the floor. I'd like to thank both speakers. Let me start by saying that this is an extremely useful book on several levels. I do appreciate that the authors demonstrate the deep inequality created by the transformations of the transition. And also, and they persist, although it seems that they are visible in many East European societies after 1989. Many people did not profit from the changes, and inequalities keep deepening with other crises that we lived through in recent years. And the political leadership in the Czech Republic does not wish to admit it. So some of our political leaders should read the book and think about it. This book is very useful also because it demonstrates a simple thesis that the transformations were not either or, neither a success nor a complete failure. So the debate about the 1990s mentioned by Kateřina, there was a debate which started after the Czech TV series called The 90s. So the debate was getting to that, but there were only some hints. In the Czech public space, the statement that transformations were either good or bad is controversial. The public discourse in this country is more or less dominated by people who entered the public space after 1989 and in a way profited from the changes. There was a historical boom very fast. They got very important positions. Many of them started their professional lives in the 1980s, 90s. They were educated, living in cities, and they had an ideal situation to really exploit all the opportunities, opening of the market, opening of the borders, freedom of expression, and so on. So this group is still very influential and determines the direction of the public discourse. And this doesn't go on only for the Czech Republic, but other neighboring countries as well. But we may say that their experience does not represent the majority of the population. But for these people who are active, the criticism of the 90s criticism is the same as defense of communism. And that's a big issue in the public debate. If you imply that during the transformation some mistakes were made, there was a negative social impact, that person is seen as someone who says things were better under communism. And that, of course, is still unacceptable in the Czech public discourse. But as for the logic, it's very fragile. Let's say that the contours of the debate are built like that. And thirdly, the book is very useful and important for me as someone from another discipline than those debated in the book. I am a historian, And naturally, we could have a debate on methodology and to what extent the quantitative data are accurate. I work with qualitative data. I can have some objections to whether you can compare Czech Republic with Tajikistan, and whether the positions at the beginning were determined by different historical situations. So it's difficult to compare such two countries, industrialization and so on, development. Also, data gathering, can the methods be compared? But that's a debate on methodology. That's only for connoisseurs, so to speak. But there is a general argument brought by the book, which is very convincing. Yes, we have two different narratives about East European transformations, and they develop from methods used in various disciplines. So it seemed quite amazing when I read the book. Many of the social sciences disciplines try to create a picture of the entire transformation using just a specific part of the transformation, a group of people or a set of data which are selective, and then they try to come to some broader conclusions whether the transformation was a failure or a success. That's why I appreciate the goal of the book to really harmonize these various positions, and that's why we need historians. Historiography is a synthetic discipline. It does not rely only on one kind of discipline, but it tries to synthesize various disciplines. So, if I noticed it right, only Philip Ter is the only historian who is cited. His work was a kind of avant-garde in the historical investigation of the transformation. And it's not like Mitchell said in his presentation when people would say, when they were writing the book, enough has been said about transformations. No. In fact, we should start talking about transformations from the historical viewpoint. We already have the historical perspective showing things we didn't see. And there is also a framework which is provided by this book. The history of transformations cannot be written without taking into account inequality. That's the only way how to realize what really happened. Historians have paid attention to the 1990s for many years, but there are still many other issues, questions. The perspective of inequality seems very helpful, but in the Czech Republic, and the same goes for neighboring countries, this is an uneasy task for two reasons. If you speak about inequalities, you must speak about social stratification, about classes. In the Czech academic environment, this is still rather suspicious because of the politicized heritage of the Marxist-Leninist interpretation, which before 1989 was obligatory. But otherwise, we cannot understand the changes after 1989 if we don't study how patience was really moved out of the sort of alignment or leveling. So the same goes for Slovakia. We don't have many qualitative data from the 1990s, while Polish sociology has produced many qualitative analyses already in the 90s themselves. Cultural changes, political changes. For culture, I don't mean cinema or music, but culture seen as a set of values and also relating to a social system. While in Poland, the researchers can draw from literature. In the Czech Republic, unfortunately, we are worse off. That's why we need the historical perspective. I also believe that historiography has a better chance than some other periods or disciplines because the story is not either or, success or collapse. It should draw from many even controversial resources that should create a plastic image or picture. To conclude, there are many unanswered questions. The book opens many questions excellently. It doesn't necessarily have to provide answers. For example, I believe what should be researched first is how various social groups understood what market is, what sources they use to get an idea what's ahead of them, and how in their everyday lives they adopted some ideological slogans. I could carry on. There are many topics. And the book we are discussing offers many directions in which to go, and I hope it's the beginning of a new discussion and research. Thank you. Thank you, Veronika Pehe. And now, political scientist Ondřej Slačálek. Thank you very much.
Thanks a lot for the floor and also for the opportunity to discuss with the authors of the book. I quite agree that, yes, it is extremely relevant and significant. Also that it was published now. Apart from the reasons mentioned by Veronika, I believe it's also because it gives us a chance to a bit understand Putinism and his approach, and also it is being published at the time when the social logics behind Putin can be delegitimized. I believe that right now it is simply relevant, extremely relevant and important that such a book is being published, since we can expect extreme crisis, economic crisis, which will be unprecedented and will not compete with the crises or depressions who both the authors talked about. And I'll try to word or formulate 4 questions with some marginal commentary on the book, but these are, so to say, marginal comments. It is, I highly acknowledge and appreciate the book. The first, and this will refer to the individual chapters and not necessarily to what you have said here. In the introduction, at the beginning, you describe or quote Jeffrey Sachs and other experts who simply came to post-socialist countries with recipes that they had tried and tested in Latin America or countries of the third world. And they saw the differences between between the post-socialist countries and Latin America, but didn't consider them essential or important. And I wonder whether they were right or wrong. Because what they wanted to simply have market economy society being created and introduce the totality of market rules and do away with the market barriers so that majority of populations could join or get engaged in market mechanisms, because in good faith they believed this was necessary for both the regions to, so to say, normalize. And there were differences, of course, between Latin America and post-communist or post-communist countries, which relevant. You consider them so obvious that you don't, so to say, elaborate on them, then you get back to it. But Latin American governments or governments in Latin American countries have never tried to offer such a massive social or welfare assistance to their inhabitants. And these are significant differences for both an economist or anthropologist of social democratic belief. But is it for a market Stalinist, for someone who wants to simply have a market economy society set up? And now the second question, how relevant are these differences to us? Your book is, so to say, tries to suggest of the world where in one region a disaster occurred and went unnoticed, but there is a competitive or counter, so to say, interpretation, globalizations of poverty, structural adjustments which were outside the core, global core. And in many countries, these resulted in deepening the social inequalities and decline or inequalities. And also in the rich, wealthy countries of the core, this occurred, especially in the past decade, with very similar political consequences like Orban, Putin, Trump, Bolsonaro, Philippines, or developments in the Philippines, Thailand, etc., etc. So, yes, what happened was that one region of the world experienced a disaster which nobody actually noticed. Václav Havel liked to talk about the post-totalitarian countries of Central country are the concave mirror of the West. Perhaps we were that with respect to global process. And this China and Vietnam you mentioned. I know even less about Vietnam than about China, so I'll use China as an example. You work with that example, and you say that a dictatorship, prevailing dictatorship in one form or another, is a prerequisite for the success, which certainly was not desirable in the countries you write about. But I wish to share one more comment. Isn't the truth that the prerequisite of Chinese miracle was internal, huge in the domestic periphery, which means a workforce that was controlled by the system of domestic passport. They were like half living in serfdom times. And the second condition or precondition, which was a massive or robust coping of technologies, which means massive breaches of applicable norms, the norms which or standards which China is in breach of is illegitimate, I believe, but I don't, of course, agree to their pirating of goods, etc. So, your argument, yes, it was impossible, it was not desirable for dictatorship to be there, but had the advisors from the West advised them some more reasonable, feasible road, perhaps it could have developed otherwise. And that leads me to the third topic, or thesis. In the book, you describe social consequences of transformation or transition, and in many cases, it is really food for thought, inspiring, like the Italian syndrome, etc. But there is a chapter in your book about corruption, and there you mainly talk about perception of corruption, and you extend the narrative or accept that it's kind of endemic for post-socialist societies, and that it is a huge issue or problem here. And my question is that true? Is it really the fact of life? We don't have to go to Greece or Sicily, that means the southern periphery of the EU. But if we take China, and if we read Steining and Perfect Dictatorship Studies and similar works, the degree or rate of corruption and the corruption which turned into autonomous life, China is really far ahead of all the post-socialist countries. The way they trade in offices or positions, and well, I guess that we would surpass the top or lower 10. So what's, the high presence of corruption or high degree or rate of corruption, I don't know whether we can actually apply the situation here to Slovakia or to other countries. Well, first conclusion, which can be generally applicable. Corruption is a false consciousness. That means wrongly about the phenomenon of existence. Daniel Schitterer, when talking about corruption as a way of blaming the domestic societies, contrary to rhetorics about the colony, which is again a unilateral blame on the external actors. Corruption is interpreted as if it was our fault only because everyone tries to help us and then everyone steals. So it's simply blaming the local domestic society, and this can be universally applied. But in the Czech Republic, and you show that the transition or transformation in Czech Republic was among the more actually successful one, and yet we had a revolt against the oligarchs or whatever we think about Kaczynski or Orban. Their revolts at least are politically meaningful, make some sense. So I believe this is the second feature of corruption discourse. Corruption always affects the state. Civil servants, top politicians are to be blamed, and not those private individuals who make them corrupt. It's always blaming the state or the government, and I believe it is an extremely important characteristic which does work in the corruption discourse. That brings me to the last point. What is the political lesson learned? Well, there can be two lessons learned. First, you and enable the post-communist countries to join the club of post-communist victims or what. So we should have some specific rules applied or standards we have to meet because of our past sufferings and hardships. This lesson learned from your book was well understood and used by majority of political elites during the refugee crisis. You take care of the refugees. It's none of our business. We have lots outstanding problems to settle, and the same apply to the Greece crisis. We had to tighten the belts and had lots of consequences of prior regime, so don't want us to have an understanding for the Greek crisis or what. Now, I believe your book, I believe that your book offers you read it properly, yet another answer, and I don't think that was your intention. In the research, you describe two strands, paradoxical strands of post-socialist thinking and approach. On the one hand, a demand or request to have or demand for a strong, robust state, and on the other hand, sort of pathological or semi-pathological organizations, movement against the state. So it's kind of a schizophrenic requirement. So as if we didn't know what we wanted, a strong state, and also oppose this strong state or revolt against it. So these are lessons learned, I believe, from the post-socialist transformational transition to want to have a strong, a robust state which can tackle lots of things or offer solutions. That is a rational response of semi-periphery, but to want safeguards and safety nets and against the state is also rational, or what? A lesson to learn from the past period as well as from the period you describe in the book, to further elaborate on the schizophrenia and make it less schizophrenic would make sense and would be extremely valuable. And I believe it would be yet another benefit of the book you wrote. Thanks a lot, Andrzej. I guess that before we give you the floor, you can think about questions. I believe it would be only appropriate to give Mitchell and Kristen a chance to respond to Andrzej's comments in particular.
Yeah, so look, I think I understand almost everything that you said. But excuse me if I didn't fully understand everything. But, so I think there's a number of questions, and I've been writing them down on my phone. Sorry, it's a little weird that I take notes on my phone now because it looks like I'm sort of, playing on my phone, But, to answer first of all for Zepe's, questions, yes, we don't cover all fields in the social sciences, right? And we are not, we didn't cover history. We covered just 4 fields, and there are others that we certainly could have covered, right? So we don't actually, for instance, talk much about the democratization literature too much. We don't talk about history too much, and so there is a perfectly reasonable suggestion that if we added in more lenses that we look at this, the problem would look a lot different, right, in certain ways, or more precise, right? I think the same findings would still hold, honestly. But I think that that the insights of these different fields are very different and therefore valuable to have. And so I'm very happy that you're planning, this project and this center, to work on the history of transition. Is very, very important. And as you say, it's a more synthetic field, and so in a way can incorporate insights better from other approaches than other fields can. And that's to say, the other thing I liked about these comments was, in fact, this issue about, and this responds to both, I think, what we're trying to do in this book. So in a way, this book, you could say it's set up as like, this is the final word about transition, right? It's like, this is it, we finally figured out what it, but actually that wasn't really our intent. Our intent was actually to open this debate that you suggested and that you've engaged in, about what happened in the transition. And the way that we do this in this book is fairly unusual, right? In political science in particular, we always talk about causation. And I think some of your questions were asking about what is the cause? Why did this happen, right? So we specifically in this book do not answer that question at all. We don't have anything about whether it was market reforms really that caused this, or whether it was communism that caused this, or state power that caused this. We avoid this in part because of some of the reviews we received. When we started getting reviews, and this was reviewed by sort of neoliberal economists, right? They said, well, all these things have nothing to do with the reforms that we enacted, right? We think that the reviewers were actually involved in the reform process, right? And so we couldn't get through the review process saying, like, you guys, caused all this thing. But also because they could be right, that communism may have caused some of these effects, or, peripheral development could have caused this, or state strength could have caused this, right? So we decided in the end to focus only on the question of what happened, right? As we say, the dependent variable. The only question is what happened, right? And so we tried, and the reason for that is because that in itself is so controversial. It's so controversial just to show these charts, just to say there was a huge recession, that it's verified by the demographic data, right? That there's this ethnographic data, that just the public opinion data, it doesn't add up to either of these stories, actually. It's extremely controversial. And so we thought, okay, we're just going to introduce into that debate and just try to paint a more nuanced picture of what happened that takes into account both of these perspectives. And that by itself invites all these questions about what happened. And that's what we think the importance of this book is, actually, is to invite this type of debate, to sort of, a new generation of transformation discourse that will actually try to explain the actual things that happened rather than some imaginary things that people think happened during the transition. So that's one point. The questions I think that Andre raised are basically three, I would say. One is, sort of the globalization question. One is sort of the China question. And the other is the kind of, causation question in a way, or corruption question that you ask at the end. So on the globalization question, I would just say in short, this book could have been written about all neoliberal globalization in all parts of the world. It could have been written about the United States. It couldn't, and when you talk about the rise of populism being a global phenomenon, absolutely. This is just a sort of microcosm, right, of probably the most advanced and stringent implementation of neoliberal policies in the world, right, given the context, right, that was experimented on this particular region, but you see the same results everywhere else, right? That some people do great and some people not so great. So that's, in a nutshell, how I would kind of answer that question is, yes, of course, this is a story about a group of countries that in a way aren't that special, right, compared to others, or that are diverse between Tajikistan and Czech Republic, but everywhere is diverse and the same sort of results really would apply everywhere. And so this is in a way an entry into a much bigger debate as well. On the China question, I guess I would say that do we know, so on the one hand, China, I think that you were saying China is like kind of really different, basically. Okay, so of course, that's true. What I wanted to focus on in China, though, is that China, in my view, one of the ways it's different is that it chooses its own national approach to reform, which I think you also referred to, if I'm not mistaken, that they had a very specific way of doing it. The specific strategy that China used was what I would call as dualism. So they created a new private economy and grew the new private economy without privatizing the state economy. They kept the state economy. And in fact, the state economy remained the dominant economy in China up until 2000 or 2004, when then it finally became more of a minority. So rather than doing the radical privatization, a radical, we need to do this all at once, approach that was tried in Central Europe, which, by the way, I think was disastrous, or the data would show seems to have been disastrous. They did it a very different way, this kind of gradual approach, right? And of course, they were helped by many factors, that don't apply, like the people moving off the land into the cities and many other things. But my feeling about this is that we've tried this experiment, and the results are very, very decisively clear that the gradual strategy worked better. It worked better. Is it applicable everywhere? I don't know. But I would say this, that I believe that from perspective of today, that it's pretty clear to me that had the international organizations wanted to pursue a gradual strategy in the Czech Republic or in other post-communist countries such as Tajikistan or such as Uzbekistan, they would have been able to do that. I believe that because, as we see, these countries followed the international advice very, 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 very carefully for at least 20 years. And had the advice been different, they would have followed that advice also. So that's my feeling about it. But again, we don't, that's an experiment we're never going to get to do. I would just say that the real question is really this dualism versus the radical reform strategy that seems to be very much in question. Now, the question of corruption, I guess I agree to some extent. I mean, we don't make a big deal about corruption in the book, actually. I mean, I know you reacted to this question, but the only time we talk about corruption in the book is we notice it in public opinion surveys, because there have been retrospective public opinion surveys that ask people, was the society more corrupt, before 1989 or now, right? And people very decisively say that under communism, things were less corrupt than they are today, okay? So something like 85% of people across the region in EBRD surveys say things were much less corrupt under communism, right? And, we don't really know exactly what to make of that, but what we take from it is simply as a kind of discontent that people are seeing or saying with the system, right? So it's not really, I don't think it's fair to say that we're, blaming people for this, but it's rather more the people in their public opinion surveys are blaming the transition, right, for creating this corruption, essentially, right? That's how we kind of take it. And we don't know, personally, I'm not like a massive opponent of corruption, I think corruption is bad, but it's not clear that corruption is bad for democracy. It's not clear that corruption is bad for economic growth, and you gave the case of China. Corruption is more of an indicator of good government, essentially. And people are more comfortable with their government if it appears to be less corrupt. I just came from Finland, by the way, and so, in places like Finland, people will say, oh no, the government is not corrupt, but they may also be just saying that we have more social services, I'm not sure. So yeah, I don't think I would make as big a statement about that, but I agree, more or less with what you say, that it's kind of, I guess the way I would phrase it is, it's just a sign of discontent, really, essentially, for people to say. Let me just end by saying that, let's take the perspective that at the beginning of transition, you're an advisor, for instance, or you're a government official, and you're in the IMF. And by the way, we have all the IMF minutes now. So we've, in previous work, I've been looking. You can see they have 25 years of secrecy, but now they've released all the meetings regarding post-communist transition. So you can read exactly what they were discussing at the time in early 1990s online. And I've done that, if you're sitting there thinking, well, we have this really, really risky approach to economic reform, right? In some countries, we know it could produce really good results. In some countries, it may produce really, really disastrous results, right? And what's interesting about this is that people chose that strategy anyway, right? Knowing that it could have extremely disastrous results, right? And maybe you're right, I think you are right, that in Czech Republic or somebody with a stronger state, right, that could tailor more, or China, tailor more the advice, then you're taking less of a risk, right? But if you're, Georgia or something like that, you're taking more of a risk. But the question really is, I think, has to be asked, why did people advise that? Right? If you're a doctor, it's kind of like advising, an extremely risky operation, right? Why was that advised, actually? Why did people talk about this as if this is going to be the best thing ever, right? When they knew it was extremely risky, and why did people undertake it? Why did countries undertake these policies when it could obviously have such negative effects? So that's just one of the questions I think we need to be sort of raising at this point, and talking about. But again, I think there's a lot of questions. There's questions about causation. There's questions about specific points and specific data. But that's exactly what we want to do. We don't want to close off. We want to just really begin this type of conversation of this book.
Díky moc Mitchellovi.
Oh, Kristen.
Thank you very much.
Also, yeah.
Výborně.
Can I add?
Yeah, of course,
Please, yeah.
Yeah, I'm sorry. Yeah, so I just want to highlight a couple of things that Mitchell said that I think are really important. I think this question of why did they undertake these reforms when they could have been, there were other options of more gradual approach that would have lessened the social impacts of the transition. I think we have to remember that at least in the United States, the USAID, the United States Agency for International Development, and other international organizations often do the bidding of Western transnational corporations who saw an incredible market opportunity to expand their goods and services to a massive population of 400 million people who would now be buying Nivea and Colgate and Volkswagen and all of the things that you all now have. I'm sure that that's great, but a lot of the foreign policy, I think, was being partially driven by the desire, exactly what Manfred Bach said in 1991. West German corporations looked at the privatization of Eastern Germany as a boon for their bottom line. And so that's the first point, right? There's this economic kind of imperialist strategy that underpins some of this advice, which at the time was wrapped in the wrapping paper of democracy and freedom and liberalization and more shopping and travel abroad and all these wonderful things that people wanted. And what they didn't realize was they were basically opening their economies to the penetration of Western corporations who didn't care anything about the ordinary people living in those countries. So that's the first thing. The second thing is corruption. I started doing field work in the 90s in Bulgaria, and I can tell you that corruption went both ways. Western businessmen were very happy to pay bribes to any public official who would be able to get done what they wanted to get done. The only moment that Western governments and Western business people started complaining about corruption was when the cost of the bribes became too high. Because as long as the bribes were cheap, everybody was happy to pay them to get everything done. But when people started getting more and more money or demanding more money, they were suddenly accused of being corrupt because Western corporations no longer wanted to pay. And as to the the question of why local elites would accept these policies, clearly one of the reasons is because they benefited from those policies. Where I work in Bulgaria, and this is true throughout the Balkans, I think, there are many people today living in very nice houses with very nice cars, whose kids have gone to very good universities in the United States and the UK, who were the beneficiaries of these early economic policies, whereby if you happened to be in the right place at the right time, you got an incredible amount of money by selling your country's assets to foreigners. I mean, I know that's not an okay thing to say, but I think, and here I would really like to emphasize something that Professor Pehe said in her comments, which is that we have to be able to talk about what happened in the 1990s without being accused of saying that communism was better, right? You can be critical of the 90s. You can be critical of the transition process without being nostalgic for some weird communist past that most people agree was pretty unpleasant, to say the least. So the reason I think that we cannot have the conversation about the 1990s is because, in part, the political and economic elites who benefited from the redistribution of state-owned property into private hands in the 1990s are still in power. And if anybody questions the sources of their wealth or the sources of their power and influence, the best way to shut those people up, to make them silent, is to accuse them of being communists. And I think that that's part of a broader strategy in the region. And although, Mitchell and I, Professor Orenstein and I, were very careful in the book not to talk about causation, and I think that was the right decision for this book, I do hope that historians and political scientists and sociologists and economists and many other disciplines, even people in the humanities who are looking at the literature and the television and the movies of this era, will start to really look critically at what was happening in the 1990s. Because yes, it was absolutely a moment of growing global economic hegemony of neoliberalism. But I think what happened to Eastern Europe, the way that Eastern Europe was sort of forcibly brought into this economy, has not only precipitated the rise of some of this populism, but in many ways, because of the critique that any criticism of neoliberalism in the 90s in Eastern Europe is somehow pro-communist, that in order to be critical of capitalism, you automatically are a communist, that is what is one of the reasons that is preventing a more critical reaction to global neoliberalism today. So I think that these things are very much related, and one of the things that Mitchell and I say in the book, and I think it's really important, is that transition is not over. Just like Americans today still think about the Great Depression in the United States as a major economic moment that has reverberations for public policy, even in the present, in 2022. I think that people in Eastern Europe will be talking about the recessions that followed the transition from socialism to capitalism 100 years into the future. And so we really need to start those conversations now, and we need to start them off with an open mind and without all of the name-calling that goes along with criticizing these events of the recent past, through which many ordinary people lived and which they remember. And their personal experiences do not always match up with the narratives that they've been told by the political and economic elites who have the most to gain by pretending that everything was just perfect or that it couldn't have been done any better. And I think that's a really important point to end on.
Díky moc. To by už skoro mohlo být závěrečné.
Well, So thanks a lot. This might be the closing remarks, but we want to give a chance to the audience, to or participants there to comment on or ask a question or whatever. Perhaps we will gather the several questions or comments. Wait for the mic, please. May I start? Okay, yeah. Zena Schmidová, translators community. I, as a contemporary, wanted to say that some sociological conclusions seem to be ridiculous to us contemporaries, but I had the same feeling when I read my dad's book, namely the thesis by Masaryk on suicide. I also thought there were said, even though, of course, we have admired Masaryk extremely much, but there were some things which were really funny or ridiculous because the interpretation differed entirely from our understanding who had lived through it, who had experienced it. So majority of assets actually became the property of ex or former communists, and now it's owned by their children, grandchildren, great-grandchildren, and they were never let in or among themselves, the non-communists or former. I come from a non-communist family. I come from an intellectual book, the translator of Don Quixote, so Hispanic translator of Hispanic literature. So it was not communism, by the way, it was socialism, because we have never ever reached the stage of communism. We were just drawing close or approximating communism, but we never achieved that stage. I had a cataract surgery, so I can't see properly. I haven't read your book as yet, but I wish to comment on what Madam Kristen said, namely that young people are by 1 centimeter or as shorter as against their fathers or grandfathers. Well, they are shorter, but it's not because of malnutrition. Their food has always, until recently, been cheap, but you know, the fashion of emaciated persons in the West only got here with a major delay, and this has also been declared by the lady doctor. Body mass index simply was or decreased by God knows how many percent. Once you had 70 kilograms, 170 centimeters, it was different than it is now. So people are kind of skeletal or emaciated, and young children are afraid to eat because their classmates would make fun of them. Now, I wish to thank you for actually starting up this debate, but Madam Pehe, I'm afraid, or I've got the feeling, lives in an entirely different world. The truth you can't really say because you are always silenced by the former communists and by those who have profited from that. So I'll hand over the floor to somebody else. Thanks for the commentary or comments. And well, I will take up the opportunity and take the floor. I just wanted to say that I believe it was simply great that Andrei, so to say, introduced a more global dimension, since when we talk about the transitional transformation, we oftentimes take that as something that happened here only, but we soon started joining the world with neoliberal tendencies already. So when you look back to the history or the Third World, Jason Hickel and McLean authors describing it, it is not surprising that IMF or World Bank did not actually support the gradualistic approach or, so to say, development, which in your view, based on the data, is better. Since on the contrary, when some Latin American countries introduced that, there were coup d'etat data, carrying structural programs conditioned by debt or high indebtedness, which was not nice either. So I guess our region actually joined this or entered this world, and it's no surprise that we had this shock doctrine here as well. Thanks a lot. So this was a comment rather than a question. Does anyone want to ask a question or pose a question? It's not a must, but you have the opportunity, a brief question. Well, you also talked about how this book, so to say, shifted or moved the debate. Do you have an experience from other countries that you describe in the book, Poland, Romania, or even countries more to the east? What sort of stage has the book reached there? Is there readership, or is it comparable, the response in Poland to that in the Czech Republic, or what? And back there, someone wants to ask a question. Well, concerning the first comment, it is remarkable that 30 years after the transition or transformation, we still talk about former communists and not current communists who have taken advantage of their simply prior former positions in the past.
Authors of the book. I'm sorry I came late, so I don't know quite what you said about the question of democracy versus dictatorship before, but I would be interested in not just distinguishing between the more dictatorial, more obviously dictatorial states that emerged in, say, Central Asia versus the more obviously liberally democratic states that emerged in Central Europe in the 90s, but also the very specific ways that the way it was possible, even in a formal democracy, to push through specific policies that were not, let's say, not popular, or at least not voted on by the people in those countries. It seems like it's important to make kind of a very specific analysis of what kind of democracy worked at this particular moment in this particular way to make these policies possible without a dictatorship.
Díky moc. Ještě někdo?
Thanks a lot. Anyone else wants to take the floor? If not, I'd like to ask the panelists to respond to those two questions.
Kristen, do you want to go first?
Okay, I'll just, I can take the first question about the reactions. I think one of the things that has been really interesting for both Professor Orenstein and I since the book came out is we have done several events in Germany, in Poland. We did a podcast in Georgia. And one of the strange things is that there's a sense of people becoming very emotional because they either experienced this transition themselves or they're younger and they spent much of their early adulthood perhaps listening to their parents complaining about what happened in the 1990s. And because there was this narrative that everything was going really well and that if you somehow didn't benefit from the transition or if you perceived that the transition was really difficult for you or your family, that this was something that was wrong with you or your family, and it was not a broader problem of the transition process. And I think that, so far at least, where we have had reactions in Eastern Europe, there's been a couple reviews in the Balkans. As I said, we gave a couple talks in Germany and Poland, and now here. I think there's been a general willingness to kind of go back and revise the opinion especially of the 1990s. I think there's also been a fair amount of resistance because obviously people want to say, well, that's in the past. Why should we pay attention to it? We can't do anything about it now. We can't change. But I think it's really important to really think about what we did and what we didn't do, especially from the perspective of Western leaders. You know, there was a Marshall Plan for Germany and Japan and much of Europe after World War II. There was a lot of debt forgiveness. The West in general didn't do any of that for Eastern Europe. You know, the Soviet Union was made to pay off its outstanding debts. There was very little in the way of aid, even though really major figures in the West, Richard Nixon, James Baker III, who was the Secretary of State at the time, economists like Jeffrey Sachs, people were saying there really needed to be Western aid to this part of the world in order to avert some of these social and humanitarian catastrophes, but it wasn't sent. Instead, there were just more economists implementing more neoliberal policies. So far, I think that the reaction to the book has been pretty positive in the sense that it is sparking a really important debate. And I hope that that debate continues. And I really hope, profoundly hope, that more scholars and thinkers and activists from the region will find the courage to start critiquing and start looking more critically at what happened in the 90s, despite the fact that they will inevitably be called communists.
Díky moc.
Yeah, maybe I'll just add to that saying I think this question about, you know, is the Czech debate different than some of the other debates? I think I got the question right, something like that. So yes and no, right? So I think that I would say that Czech Republic belongs to these countries where the neoliberal discourse is extremely highly embedded in most of the institutions of power in the country, including, by the way, in academic departments, which we didn't realize that much, because in the US, it's like the opposite, you know? In the US, like, academia hates, you know, neoliberalism, but here it's actually the opposite. Even more left-leaning intellectuals, you know, oftentimes just accept a lot of, like, neoliberal principles, right? So we've, you know, sometimes, so I think that's common, you know, it's not unusual for Czech Republic, but Poland, I think, is very similar in that way, and a few other places. And sometimes we have gotten very emotional reactions, right? Again, this is the thing that most surprised us about the reaction to this book, is that sometimes we get very emotional reactions, like to this book that's all like data, you know? And it's because people are seeing like their own experiences reflected, right? You know, that I went through my entire career, you know, behaving according to neoliberal guidelines of what I could say and what I couldn't say about this sort of thing. And now you're giving me the opportunity to say something different, you know. Or my parents lived through the transition. I may have done well in my career, but my parents actually really suffered, right? Or somebody I know suffered, right? So those are the sorts of things that are interesting. I would say that the difference in Georgia, it was interesting because there, you know, in some countries, maybe there's a lot less acceptance of this, and it becomes more of a pro-anti-Russia thing. So, for instance, in Georgia, if you ever critique the neoliberal approach, you're called pro-Russian, right, effectively. And that sort of shuts down debate quite a lot. On the democracy question, I want to take that a second. You know, democracy is, well, let me just pose the question this way, right? I mean, I think on the one hand, there were, as Kristen, I think, said, Professor Ghodsee, we have a lot of evidence, right, that people really like the democratic freedoms, the freedom to travel, all these sorts of things, right? On the other hand, you have to ask yourself, how many countries really are democracies among the post-communist countries? Right? We've been told for decades, right, that there's a process of democratization happening, right? But at the same time, I mean, that really was untrue, actually, for most, or at least half the countries, right? I mean, nowhere in Central Asia ever democratized. Frankly, Russia never democratized. I would say that Russia, you know, never became a democracy. If you consider that there was ever a free and fair election and where the power changed hands in Russia, it simply didn't happen. Yeltsin handed off power to Putin, who handed off power to Medvedev, right? So where was the democratic election? If you look at the Caucasus too, I don't think you see any cases really of democracy, actually. Maybe Georgia, you can put in this category, but basically you're talking, and even now, right, you have the backsliding in Hungary and such like that. So you're talking about a relatively small number of countries really that are undergoing a process of democratization. And that's just another reflection of this kind of narrative we have in our head that's just like totally, wrong. We could have written a whole book about that. Maybe we should have done that. But I mean, it just didn't happen that way, right? And so that's just another thing we have to get our heads around a little bit. I want to respond sort of to the context question about Latin America, and this question also is raised about, did it matter that people said, well, there's no difference, right? So I think that the move that the economists made, they're very sophisticated people. Like, we know a lot of them, actually, and we invited Jeffrey Sachs to a conference where we discussed the book, and also Anders Åslund and many neoliberal economists, because we wanted to be in dialogue with these people. And I guess the difficulty is that, where am I going with this? Yes, that what they decided at the beginning was they are very well aware. Like, they're super experts about things. Anders Åslund is like probably one of the best experts really about what's going on in Russia, in the world, right, and Ukraine and many other places. He's extremely knowledgeable. The issue wasn't that they didn't see there were contextual differences. The thing is that they said that doesn't matter for this market revolution that we want to have. That the same policies and the same approaches to achieve market revolution should be taken in Czech Republic or in Bogota. I mean, it's basically the same, right? In terms of, we want to have a market revolution, so we have to do this and that policies. Now, increasingly in development economics, and I follow Danny Roderick, who's a really well-known economist, on this, who says, essentially what economics has missed overall is context, right? Even if you believe in market revolution, the way you impose it in Colombia should be different than the way you impose it in the Czech Republic or China, right? And in fact, part of, again, the Chinese model is a very, very careful analysis of domestic conditions and what's going to work here, right? So the goals weren't different, globalization, integration. What was different was that they took seriously their own domestic context, and they trusted their own people enough and their own economists enough to say, well, we're going to pick and choose. And they would study a problem and figure out what's a good domestic way to approach it. And frankly, that was what a big part, I think, of what was missing in these processes, is we got the same policy for Tajikistan and the same policy for Belarus and the same policy for Czech Republic, and that was obviously ridiculous. I would also point out that when you look at, I have another paper I've been working on for too many years now, but I'm hoping to submit eventually, that is about growth rates in this region. And what you find about growth rates, and this may surprise you too, but again, we don't talk about causation, so we didn't really bring this up, but reforms don't cause growth. This is actually a well-known finding in the literature, right? So economists very long time told you that that if you do all these economic reforms, you're going to have higher growth rates. Ever since, I think, when was Sachs's article? Well, he had an article at least in 2018, but it's been known since about 2010 that there's zero relationship, let me just say it again, zero relationship between how many reforms you did and your economic growth rate. And Jeffrey Sachs himself has an important paper on that. The main reason that is because of natural resource endowments, right? So it turned out in this region of the world, they have a lot of natural resources, particularly in Russia and former Soviet Union. And growth rate is primarily dependent on the price of natural resources. So basically when price of oil is low, Russia didn't grow. When the price of oil was $100 a barrel, guess what? Russia grew really dramatically. In fact, Belarus's growth rate is higher than the Czech Republic's during this period of time. It starts off lower, but it's actually higher. And that's not because they did reforms any better, I'm sure, but it has to do simply with the price of oil. So that's another contextual element that was completely left out of neoliberal policy. Neoliberal policy, the World Bank, IMF, we carefully checked this. They never advised anything having to do with natural resources. They never said, oh, there's a difference between natural resource dependent countries and other countries. They can take advantage of it in some way. Here's a strategy for if you're going to be, in fact, what they said is like, let's eliminate coal production, let's eliminate dominate, some of the natural resources. Their model was just that there were going to be industrial growth, right, in countries which presumably you could expect from the beginning were never going to have industrial growth, right? We just mentioned Tajikistan, Kyrgyzstan, Kazakhstan, right? And so these contextual elements were, I think, absolutely crucial, and was one of the key reasons why these policies didn't work everywhere. They worked in certain countries for sure. I would agree that overall that in the Czech Republic or Poland or Slovenia, things haven't turned out too terribly, right? Absolutely, we see all the prosperity we see in the data. Everybody's life satisfaction going up. It's wonderful to behold. It's just that if you were in a different context, a different type of country, you weren't going to experience the same sort of transition, and so there should have been at the beginning much greater attention to the context.
Díky moc za reakci. Já mám sice pocit.
Thank you for the response. I think there is still Ondřej's question about the adequate political response. I agree with what you said. The only persons who could find an answer are the nationalists who grab the sentiments of the revolution, and they offer the defeated people some dignity. But of course, this is already over time, and this academic panel is maybe not right to discuss the very political questions, so we'll all keep them for later. We'll think about them and ask questions to maybe other people, other experts. But I would like to thank you. This is a very nice evening in June. Thank you for coming here for the debate. I'd like to thank the panelists, Kristen Ghodsee, who is in Germany at the moment, and she's not well. There's a flu, so I'd like to thank her very, very much. Despite not being well, she found time to be with us. Mitchell Orenstein, who came from the US to be with us, and Veronika Pehe and Ondřej Slačálek. So goodbye for Friedrich Ebert Stiftung and Právo.